Hey, what's going on, everybody? Welcome back to the Land Development Podcast. I'm your host, Ryan Glick. If this is your first time joining us, each week when you tune in, you will hear one of two different types of episodes. Sometimes when you tune in, you're going to hear industry news. That's where we pull up a few different headlines and we talk about what it means for the land development industry. Other times when you tune in, you are going to hear an interview style show, and that's where we have on someone associated with the land development industry and we talk about their origin story, and then we dig into some topics that are of interest to them. Now, today I'm excited to have on the show with me Jack Rowe. Jack is a land development expert out of the North Texas area. Jack, thanks for joining me.
Yeah, it's my pleasure. Thank you for having me, Ryan. Looking forward
Yeah,
to chatting.
yeah, absolutely. And what's kind of cool with our conversation here and kind of digging into this is that the last episode that everybody listening right now would have heard is was from Tim Early with the Texas A&M program. And so when I was doing some research into you coming into this episode, it looks like that's where you got your start in your education. And so I'd be interested, digging back into your origin story a little bit and going into how you got into land development and everything. Can you walk us through your path and how you got into where you're at today?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. I did not know from a young age I wanted to do real estate. It really never had occurred to me. So I kind of tried my hand at a few things in college. Started out general studies at A&M. I don't think you can even do that anymore, at least at A&M. And kind of floundered around for a bit trying to find what spoke to me and did some finance coursework, and then I was like, I need something creative, is what I thought, and so I switched to architecture school, uh, which quickly kind of burnt me out. Just the culture, I slept under my desk a lot. That's kind of normal, living off of coffee and 5 hour energy drinks. So, but I was still attracted to the built environment, you know, the product of architecture and all that. Uh, and then so it was just kind of like growing my interest in education about design, placemaking, and I took my own coursework in like sustainability. I had one class that was in development in my final semester, which kind of exposed me to a new idea. And I'm from a mid-sized town, Huntsville, Texas, prison city, as most people know it. Uh, there was not much development going on when I was a kid, or all through my 18 years living there. And so it just never occurred to me, that that was the thing you could do. Uh, and through architecture school, I was attracted to that side of things. And then I studied abroad in Barcelona, I guess when I was, probably junior year. And I'm from a small town. I think I'd been to California or something before that, right? So I hadn't been well traveled. And that kind of just blew my mind about, how walkable and diverse uses. And it was just an incredibly interesting place to walk around and hang out. And that kind of gave me the bug. Um, and so then I had an internship after undergrad with a local developer up in North Texas who had done the Adriatica development up in McKinney. So, which pretty unique, interesting place if you haven't seen it. And that just kind of opened my world to all of what a developer does. Like you're dealing with attorneys, city officials and staff, engineers, contractors, bankers, equity groups. So just very kind of dynamic and exciting for me. Uh, I didn't go into development after that, and kind of floundered a bit, and was involved in a startup with some guys I knew from college that just ended up it just fizzled out. And I realized through the entrepreneurial journey that I need to learn a lot more about business because they don't talk about money in architecture school, believe it or not. Most contractors and developers would know that, but uh, so I went back to school and I had a friend, a developer here in Texas or North Texas, Demarius Seals. We went to undergrad together. He was like a year ahead of me in the program, and so he spoke very highly of it. My mentor, who was then running the program, the predecessor of Tim Early, was Dr. Kent Anderson, who kind of rehashed the curriculum. And he was a kind of a developer up in McKinney area, and he was working on Trinity Falls at the time. And so it was a very pragmatic curriculum. almost like trade school for land development kind of, but project management, construction, financing, financial modeling, um, due diligence, zoning. We just looked at all of it. And so I got accepted into that program, and I jokingly say that I bought my way to having a foot in the door. Because spent the time in the masters, took it really seriously, did a lot of networking, which I learned the value of when I was in Portland, being an entrepreneur. So yeah, kind of happened into it.
Nice, nice. So when you went through the program, was part of that experience thinking about how that could springboard you into what you're going to do next, and like essentially the networking that you're talking about and everything? Is that something you were thinking about? Like, hey, I I want to try to find a great place to end up and use these skills that I'm learning in the program, or did you already have your idea on like where you wanted to go and you were just trying to build the skills there?
Uh, I guess I didn't have like a finish line vision of where I was headed. I knew I was very idealistic, like probably most people coming out of school are, and I just wanted to build cool places, right? And that was my appeal for architecture, right? And then having an internship with the developer, I'm like, oh, the developer really decides what's built. The architect draws the plans and sleeps under his desk. So, um, that attracted me to it, but I was really just looking for the best employment option. It was early on. I was idealistic about what I wished I could do with what I had learned, but it was very much a practical decision about you know earning a living and having a fulfilling career where I could learn a lot and be exposed to a lot of new stuff.
Yeah. We were, when you and I were talking, about a week ago or so, you brought up a couple different things. And one of those, I hadn't really heard the term before. And so you talked about the missing middle housing. And I'm curious if you can kind of walk through what that even means, what it is. And then I want to dig into it a little bit deeper beyond that, but maybe just start a little bit with what it is.
Okay, well, yeah. So I got exposed to that. So when I started the program, I made friends with a guy, Rob Fox, who gone on to do some cool stuff in like South Africa and elsewhere. And he was really bought into New Urbanism, which is the Congress for New Urbanism. Most people will know what Seaside, Oregon, or Seaside, Florida is. They've probably been there for vacation. That was designed by kind of the founder of the CNU, Andres Duani, along with other folks. Uh, and so I kind of got exposed to a lot of these very progressive ideas about quality, walkability, what makes good urbanism, and missing middle is just a necessary tool in that. So Daniel Perelik um, is the guy, the architect. He coined the term missing middle, which really just defines what is missing today in housing, right? Because it used to be uh, a lot more products available. And now it's like you pretty much have single family detached homes and block size, like mega block size apartment complexes with 400 units. And what's in between? That's the missing middle. Uh, so he has a book, which I would encourage anyone to read or buy. It's not like a reading book as much as it's an architecture book. He has a lot of floor plans, examples of lot layouts and site planning uh, that basically shows you the continuum of the missing middle. So you have what's the next increment up from a single family house is maybe a duplex or attached townhomes or more dense per acre uh, housing, right? And then you have cottage courtyards, which is maybe fee simple homes centering around a common HOA owned and managed courtyard. And then you have uh, fourplexes, sixplexes, up to a 12 pack, and then so it's just that's the missing middle. Um,
Okay.
what's required for that is zoning reform because it doesn't happen because it's not legal, basically. Or if it is, if there is a path to getting uh, approvals to build that type of product, it's probably not worth the squeeze, right? Because at the end of the day, I don't think building housing is all about money. I think there should be some care involved. But if it doesn't make profits, then it's not going to happen, right? It's not
Right.
sustainable to lose money. So uh, I just think it's needed now. And I think I had to listen to your interview with Charles Covey, and he was talking about that need too, right? And I feel so. Build to rent is kind of has in a way kind of co-opted the term missing middle. In a way, it is a different product dimensionally or formally than single family, and it's not a apartment complex in that way, but they're really apartments with different architecture. Uh, and the scale of them, I would say, kind of precludes them from being missing middle because the whole point is that ownership, I guess you could say, right?
Yeah.
So just the diversity creates more opportunities for more and more developers to compete with each other, and ideally that results in like a free market and having housing prices that are attainable, right? So maybe somebody can't afford a single family house, but they want to own something and build equity, and maybe they can buy a duplex and rent out one half, and that allows them to do it. Or they can buy a patio home or a smaller house on a smaller lot, right? But cities are mandating lot minimums, right? They even on a lot they'll regulate what's the smallest house you can build on that lot, and so there's a lot of red tape that makes it difficult to build housing that people can afford, especially coming out of COVID, where we saw real estate prices explode. And
Right.
it's great. We need appreciation, right? The opposite is bad. If you think about it for 30 seconds, you'll know why. But it happened so fast, right? Wages are still lagging. Wages have not caught up, and so we're constrained uh, for entry level housing, right? And so, to me, missing middle is whether you like duplexes or whatever. Um, I see it as just a necessary change that needs to happen to adapt to the reality of the land market, labor market that we have now that's just kind of priced out a lot of people. And so what
Yeah.
do we do? I mean, one example would be I think in my perfect world, right, you have a city is to me is almost like it's a biological organism in a way, right? It's a superhuman organism of millions of people cooperating in a confined space. Well, that has a life cycle, right? And so Dallas is still operating under suburban subdivision regulations, right? Well, it's I lived in central Dallas and kind of the urban area for my first 4 or 5 years I've been living in Dallas, and there's a lot of duplexes. They're 100 years old because there's an old planned development zoning that covers a lot of Highland Park and south of Highland Park and North Oak Lawn, to where you have neighborhoods like block after block after block of duplexes up to 12 packs, and they look like regular houses. It doesn't. You're not like, oh, this is yucky. They're all custom. They're all pretty much everything's 100% masonry. Uh, it's a nice look and feel, right? And so what makes sense there in this growth of a city, right, is maybe you have a 100-year-old duplex, maybe you tear it down and you build a sixplex. Well, now you have more constraints because parking minimums have been adopted since that original zoning. So maybe by zoning you could build this, but you'd have to provide so much parking that it kills the deal. And so there's a lot of different policies that factor into what you can do. But I'm a big proponent of giving us more options, a diversity of housing, so that people and developers have the most interest and the most skin in the game in their deal. They should be able to decide what their customers want because they will know better than uh, somebody who isn't
Right.
doesn't have the money on the line, right? And so I just think it's a necessary step in kind of America's progress. Like, we're a new country. We've built out a foundation, and some places are ready to change some of the rules for building so that we can move into that next stage of growth. Um, that's how I see it.
Yeah. And I want to get into the zoning reform here in just a second, but I want to touch on a couple things that you just talked about there. So, first thing is the main driver, it sounded like the main driver for this is that there's demand, and the demand revolves mostly around affordability. That we're missing. Is that it? Like we're missing housing, and the missing middle is going to provide some of the more affordable housing, or is that only possible if the zoning reform happens, and then these projects can be done at a level that would provide that housing at affordable level? Am I hearing that right?
Uh, I think so. Well, let me. I'm going to take what I think you said and say what I want to how I want to
Yeah.
respond. So we're dealing with ideas here, right? So this is theoretically, if everything's working how I think it works, which is usually not exactly right. But what missing middle could do is several things, right? We're in a chronic shortage of housing. We need more housing, right? And well, what you have with the current types of housing is subdivisions, which are cost prohibitive for the vast majority of people on Earth, right? To build, to invest in them. Not to mention the complexity of managing and putting together a deal. Even 50-acre deals complex, but they're going up to thousands of acres, right? So you typically see public builders, big institutional investors. They're the only ones who have the deep pockets to pursue that. The same exact group is the one who builds apartments because it requires tens and tens, if not hundreds of millions of dollars. And oftentimes many years before you get a single dollar back. So your peak capital may be $80 million before you sell a house or get that first rent check in the mail, right? So missing middle, if you can diversify ownership of smaller properties, so you could have smaller properties and be able to build smaller units or more diverse arrangement of units or denser, then you theoretically could have more entrance into the market. And maybe, yeah, they can't build a subdivision, but they can take 1 acre lot and build 6 houses on it, or 8 houses, or 10 houses, whatever, right? And so you'd have more people competing, which technically would put pressure on pricing, right? Because maybe one guy doesn't need a 20% return and he'll do 18%. And so that would cause probably some healthy competition and what could be delivered. And so it just kind of opens up a new avenue for people to contribute to the development of housing that are just who have no chance of doing so now. And then theoretically, that would cause more housing to get built, which puts downward pressure on pricing,
Okay.
which trickles down all the way down the supply chain, right, to the material suppliers and the labor that builds everything. But
Makes
it's
sense.
it kind of the end user and what can be passed off to the end user, the home buyer or the renter. The more you can push up their prices, the more that everyone else in the supply chain will pay. And there's a lag working backwards to the supplier, right? Well, if you start to compress prices, there will be a period of correction, but that can push down prices, and which I think is needed. Um, Charles mentioned something that I agree on. Prices got crazy hot during COVID, and when the Fed raised rates, it changes the dynamic, right? But it's taken there's that stickiness of people's memory of this price that they wish still was feasible, but it's not anymore because of interest rates, because of the construction costs and development costs that have gotten uh, relatively rapidly increased because of that phenomenon of you had 20 people bidding on a house. Well, somebody overpaid for that house, you know, and then the contractor knows that. And he's like, well, if they're selling it for over asking, then I'm going to charge more than I've been. And so we just need some sort of return to kind of stability, I think, for the industry. And it's going to vary by market, right? But Dallas is if not the most, kind of DFW is one of the most stable housing markets in the country because our fundamentals are good. We have a lot of job creation, a lot of in-migration, um, and kind of policy that's favorable for business.
Yeah. Would you say, are there any cities in the US that are doing a good job with this? Like, Are there models that you think we could potentially follow or look to as some guidance, or do you think we mainly have to look? You mentioned Barcelona in the beginning, and having these walkable cities and maybe more different structures to their city versus kind of how we've built out some of our communities and everything here in the U.S. Do you think we have to shift and more so look to some other countries, or are there places in the U.S. that have been doing this?
So there are leaders. There's more progressive city governments and state governments, right? And so, you know, not progressive in the political sense, but progressive in making progress and what we're doing. And Minnesota, specifically the Twin Cities, Minneapolis, St. Paul, uh, to my knowledge, were the first. They set the precedent. They did a zoning reform to where uh, people say they abolished single family housing. That's not true at all. What they did is they removed the limit that it has to be or it can't exceed single family housing. I'm not sure how that's shaken out now. I've seen or read articles that it's had a positive impact on their housing production for those cities. And then you had the other more progressive kind of cities do it. So Portland and Seattle, Portland, Oregon, which in my opinion has done some of the most amazing things with urban kind of land use policy. Uh, I think starting in the late 70s, maybe early 80s with their urban growth boundary. Um, and there's so many factors. This is highly complex, right? Texas has lots of land. We have lots of ways to grow. Extraterritorial jurisdictions here are huge in some cases, like Fort Worth. So the path of least resistance is you're going to build what's easiest. It's cheaper and more economical to build a one story horizontal instead of going up, right? So when you can do that, that's what you do. So they'd have to create some sort of regulations to artificially constrain uh, what can be done to facilitate what they wanted to be done. But uh, there's often kind of a disconnect between city officials who are elected, the councilmen and things, and the city staff who are educated in urban design and policy and might want something to happen that just gets shot down because a NIMBY, a neighbor doesn't want it and they're outspoken or something. But I would say, look to Portland, look to what's happened kind of on the Northwest. Uh, California, I think, has tried some zoning reform statewide. I'm not sure if it happened. I sometimes get some of the places mixed up, but
Yeah.
really, it's about, to me, it goes back to the biological analogy, right? I mean, if we're some sort of big organism that's like an ant colony, right? What do ant colonies do? In the center where there's the most activity, they go a little more vertical. It's more valuable real estate, so it shouldn't be one story. And so I just think that in areas that the land prices warrant it or enable it, that if we have really old housing stock or really old buildings that could be replaced with a more dense use, what do you get out of that? Like, say, if we could double the population in Dallas proper, that's but without expanding space wise. Well, we'd have twice as many people to buy things. So you'd see a resurgence of small businesses, all that local culture that people love, right? Uh, that's was Portland's result, right? They kind of had this microbrewery beer food culture that exploded in the 2000s, 2010s. Uh, I think that it owes that in a big way to them kind of allowing for a retrofitting and reconfiguration of their neighborhoods to, you know, maybe this guy wants to turn his house into a coffee shop and then it becomes like a hub or a third place. And then it builds community. Um, so to me, it's just kind of it's kind of a common sense approach, like, hey, I could tear down this 100-year-old house and build four houses at the same price. And there's nothing really bad about that. It's just if you don't want to live in that dense of an area, then you move to somewhere less dense. But the middle of a big city should be dense, like everywhere in the world that was built before cars were invented.
Yeah. Well, how about on the zoning reform side? So obviously, for some of the stuff to happen, there needs to be reform. I think there are some bills that are being worked on down in Texas, maybe at the state level, What do you think needs to happen, or what do you anticipate happening at the state level? Do you think anything's going to get done this year in 2025 to address some of this?
I'm pretty in the know on kind of government relations and what's going on in Texas around housing policy and home building related items, but I haven't heard a lot of talk about zoning reform in a serious way. I hope it is considered. Forward Dallas, right? That was a big kind of future land use plan, whatever, right? It's kind of like a centralized plan that the city of Dallas staff proposed, um, that I think finally got approved, but was a little bit neutered in some ways. And so there is people pushing for it, right? I think it's happening at the local level, state level. Um, the city of Fate, Texas, for example, which is a submarket we work in up here a lot. It's fast growing, small city. They have a very forward thinking staff and officials to where they've kind of pushed the envelope, and not a lot of people love it in the development community, but they're still going, right. And even though they're small, they revitalized their main street, right. And so they're trying to create place in something cool, right? Because we don't have mountains, we don't have beaches in most places in Texas. Galveston's not America's finest beach, so we're a policy driven state, right? People live here because it's affordable. There's opportunity. It's a good place to build a life. Um, but if that policy changes, that's a risk, right? So if we can't create some feature of the environment itself that makes people want to stay, you'll always have that risk that if the government changes and we flip flop on policy, then the businesses leave and the employees leave, and then we're left holding the bag. So I think um, I hope that they consider it. Uh, I've seen a lot of favorable laws passed in favor of development in the last few years, and what that has taught me is that it's not laws, it's enforcement
Yeah,
that matters, right? And so,
right.
if somebody doesn't know about the law, well, they just disregard it. And what do you have to do? You sue them, which we don't do, right? So, um, there's so many stakeholders. It's very relationship oriented business. So I'm very hopeful. I know that there's a lot of good people who care and are trying to make the changes that we need to keep the American dream alive, and keep our cities developing out in the right way. I just don't. I wish I could tell you more about it. I'll probably go do some research after this.
No, it's all good. And I think on that note, though, with kind of looking ahead in 2025 and just
Mhm.
economic conditions and just everything going on, I guess what's your personal outlook on 2025 when you think about it from a land development and housing standpoint?
I think it's going to be a year of correction. There's already been some price correction, but because it's predominantly like there's been a much bigger market share taken by the public builders because of their internal financing mechanisms, right? Um, that correction hasn't looked like people losing money trying to sell their house. It's just been we've been building a house that people can afford. Uh, I have seen it's owners have really not capitulated on price. So, uh, an example, like to build an entry level priced home in most submarkets, I would need to be in the land basis, the finished lot price would need to be at or lower than what it costs to develop it, just from a construction standpoint. So, without special district creation to facilitate uh, reimbursement, right, public financing partnerships, you can't really build entry level housing, right? So, something's got to give. So either you pay everybody more, which bakes in inflation permanently, you know, or there's some mild correction, or we can proceed. So I think that what Dallas, I can't speak for the whole country,
Sure, sure, yeah.
other than just saying things have gotten way more expensive, and the wage growth that was supposed to happen has not. So there's an affordability constraint. Um, I do think in DFW, our fundamentals are so good. Like I think we still have more people moving to our MSA than anywhere else in the country. We have so much job creation. Uh, there's a lot to do here. It's a good place to live and raise your kids and have a good time. So I think DFW will be stable and see relatively less turbulence in the years ahead. But I think that whether correction or not, we got to stabilize somehow. We can't prices can't keep pushing at the rate that they did during COVID without something breaking. So I just see a kind of a flattening out, a stabilization, but the
Okay.
demand is there. If it, the demand for what people can afford is there.
Yeah.
So we just have to find a way to build what people can afford, right?
Yep. Be able to meet them kind of where they're at. Yeah.
Right.
Well, we're at about 30 minutes, so I want to shift gears into the lightning round segment. So I've got a few different questions here. I'm going to run by you, get your
Sure.
thoughts on these. So, first one is, what's the most common mistake that you think cities make when designing streets?
Street widths and uh, making them overly wide and uh, having a negative association with grids for some reason. So uh, I guess that you sent me a little teaser of these questions, but these relate to the other questions, right? So streets should be narrower. It's safer. It costs less, right? Like just say if you could build a 24-foot wide street, which could really fit two cars on it. Maybe not if one's parked, right? But that cars could drive on that. Uh, Compared to a 30-foot street, that 30-foot street is 20% more expensive, paving and labor, right? So immediately you're reducing cost by 20%. Not to mention that the end product is safer. Not to mention that the city, who's having to fund the future maintenance of that with property taxes generated from the lots fronting onto that street, uh, they have a cheaper infrastructure to maintain. So, in all ways, it would be superior, uh, other than maybe some of the contractors who sell cement and pave streets, right?
Yeah.
But I'm sure they would be okay. So I think street widths is a big has a big misunderstanding around it, and then gridded streets I think is the safest and most efficient from a transportation perspective.
Can
It
you
enables the most flexibility.
can you explain that a little bit? Gridded streets.
Yeah. So for some reason, I'm an architect. I went to architecture school. We study design and quality of design and how people uh, inhabit space. I wasn't a civil engineer. A lot of my friends and roommates were, but I'm not sure that they go through the same design thinking um, that we do in the architecture world. Still, they're designing stuff, but they're really going off of standards on kind of boilerplate templates that are already established. So it's not ground up design typically. And for some reason, there's this sense that gridded streets are like low quality and bad. But uh, a lot of the most expensive neighborhoods in Texas I know of are on gridded streets, right? And yeah, they're older, but that didn't stop the gridded streets didn't stop them from becoming nice. And there is a misconception that uh, gridded streets are not as safe somehow. Uh, and there's another misconception, like that a speed limit works. A speed limit sign doesn't work. It's research shows that people drive based on their perception about the safety of where they are, right? So if I'm driving on a residential road or a strode, as Strong Towns has designated it, if it's a 40-foot wide road and I'm the only guy on there, I feel like I can go fast, right? Even if the speed limit says 20 miles per hour, my kids live here. You see, the 17-year-old guy with his new car going 60 down the residential road. So rules do not, it's enforcement, right?
Yeah.
So
It
let's get
is.
rid of enforcement. If you design a narrower road that feels like you need to be more attentive and careful driving on it, those people drive slower. And so uh, the width, as research shows, makes people drive slower. Having intersections, which is part of a grid, uh, tells your brain it's like somebody might pull out in front of me at any time, right? So you don't have 1,000 linear feet to where you can just hit the gas and see how fast you can go down the road. So it makes you be more attentive and careful.
Yeah.
And then from a walkability standpoint, that creates the potential for adding on and changing it later, right? So it's like, hey, maybe one day I'll bulldoze 2 houses and we'll build a cafe here, and suddenly this old, you know, bedroom community has a cafe, and it just creates more flexibility. And then from a driving perspective, if there's anything shut down, you can just zigzag a different way, right? And when I lived in Portland in 2014, I didn't have a car. I sold my car to finance my move and my startup. And so I drove to work across town on a bike, and that was so easy to do there. You couldn't do that in Dallas. Might get hit by a truck, or uh, you're crossing highways. It's just not feasible. But in Portland, they had these old historic gridded streets, not super long, uninterrupted blocks, and they had narrowish streets with 20 miles per hour speed limit. And what they did was they retrofitted it there. Everything was one way. So every other road in either direction was the opposite direction of the other one. And so you could just zigzag anywhere across town through that infrastructure. So what you had there is now multimodal transportation was possible. As to where here, you got to drive a car. So what if you don't have a car? And then what if you're old and you can't drive anymore legally? And now you're stuck at home lonely, because otherwise, if you lived in New York City, you can walk out of your house and, go say hi to the bodega owner or something and have a social interaction. But here, there's a lot of implications, if you get what I'm saying, about the inability to leave your house without getting in a car.
Yeah. Well, I have a few more questions here on the lightning round that I was going to go through, but I want to dig into this a little bit more because there's something I want to get your thoughts on. So you talked about Portland and talked about really kind of the city center and how, it's higher density. And then as you kind of get out, maybe it's less dense as you go out. So when you're thinking about the walkability of a community, do you see that as something like both in the city center as well as out in the more suburban areas? Or like, how do you kind of draw the line when you think about that? Or are you thinking when we're building, like maybe new master plan communities are being built, that these should also be thinking about, hey, we should make these master plan communities and stuff walkable as well, so that their own, kind of like a city center would be made walkable potentially. Is that kind of your thought process on that?
No.
No.
I
Okay.
mean, my personal opinion, right, is that walkability is not a byproduct of having sidewalks. It's a byproduct of having points of interest from which that you can walk to in a time that you can tolerate, right? So
Okay.
have you ever heard of like the 15-minute city?
Yeah. Yep.
Right. And so like when I lived in Portland, I didn't have a car. I walked to get my groceries. I carried the bags home. I walked, or took a bike to work. I walked to the bank. I walked to the doctor. I walked to anything I wanted to do. I could get there on foot, right? And so that's what walkability is. Walking for the sake of walking or exercise is not walkability. So I've seen like a fallacy of like being in a city, uh, you know, discussion with city staff where they're just insisting that you got to have walkability. You better put this sidewalk next to the feeder road. And in Texas, a feeder road is an access road that feeds onto the highway, right? Nobody's walking. Who wants to walk next to cars going 80 miles an hour to nothing, to nowhere? It goes nowhere. So walkability, it's nice having sidewalks, but if they're not used, what's the point, right? So what you need is different uses and points of interest in walkable proximity, right? And so typically, I'll walk anywhere that takes 20 minutes or less. You go over a mile, and then you start to be like, you know, I don't have that much time to walk, whatever. And so that's where zoning comes into play, right? Because if you have these huge zoning districts and everything is miles apart, you just, you're in your residential zoning where you live. You cannot possibly walk to the points of interest, like to the cafe or to the restaurant or bar or grocery store. And so, how do you make place all the, basically it's as simple as everything people need to do in a normal routine over the course of a month should be within a mile. Um, that's what walkability really is. And so Portland has it. Uh, our older cities in the U.S. have it, like uh, obviously New York City, the most expensive, high demand city to live. Philadelphia has it. Never been to Boston, but I'm pretty sure Boston has walkability. Um, that's and then some neighborhoods within big cities that aren't walkable are walkable. So like in Dallas, the Knox Henderson area is walkable. If you can afford to live there, you can walk to cool stuff. Lower Greenville or Lowest Greenville, uh, kind of like an entertainment center, uh, that's walkable if you can afford to live there. Oaklawn, North Oaklawn, that's walkable, right? So we have our little nodes, but you couldn't say the whole city is, and maybe that's not necessary, right? But um, walkability is a huge, it's a big box for consumers, right? It's increases your quality of life. So how to do that, especially when you're retrofitting something that's not walkable, I think is kind of just starting incrementally. And I think the greatest way to start would be like, how can we get like a local cafe or something to where people can, they don't have to wait in line at Starbucks. They can go support their neighbor who started a coffee shop, right? And that builds community, and then they have ideas in it. But I think it has to be kind of grassroots, and incremental, smaller increments.
Yeah. No, it makes sense. All right. Well, let's move on to the second one here. So, second one is, if you could reform one zoning law, what would it be?
I would get rid of parking minimums. If I'm just going to throw that into zoning, because as I said before, like you have some zoning in Dallas, where in places like where I've lived in a duplex that is walkable and you can do cool stuff there by the zoning. But when you want to build 6 units and you're grandfathered into 2 parking spaces for your duplex, it's like suddenly half of your lot is parking. And so it doesn't work. So zoning reform is kind of impotent without some other policies that have added restrictions like parking minimums. And cities on these progressive cities, they have done away with parking minimums. Like City of Portland did it some years ago. They followed behind the Twin Cities, Seattle, and I think the state of Washington are kind of have been pursuing that if they haven't already done it. So they go hand in hand.
Okay. All right. Next one. And you may have already answered this with Portland, but maybe you have a different city in mind. But what's the most walkable city that you've ever visited?
Uh, I mean, when I lived in Barcelona, I didn't have a car, and I could do everything I wanted, and it was awesome. But that just really comes down to density and the diversity of uses within a confined space. So I think Barcelona might be the most walkable as far as like being able to get whatever you need. Uh,
Mm-hmm.
Paris, France is incredibly walkable. Um, Portland in the U.S. is a very cool instance of kind of walkability. Uh, New York City is the most walkable in the U.S. Uh, I would say, here it's New York.
Yeah.
Over there, it's, in Europe, probably Barcelona, London, any of those really old cities. Because that's how, before people had cars, they had to build stuff where you could walk to it.
Right.
Right. And
Yep.
so you could pretty much just look at a timeline and say the older it is, the more walkable it's going to be.
Yep. All right. Fourth one. What's the most exciting trend in the housing market right now?
Uh, it's kind of like a silver lining to the crazy price appreciation, I think, is that it's forcing this missing middle conversation. People are starting to think about how can we change how we build things to address the housing demand, because um, short of just telling all the landowners their land isn't worth what they want it to be, which just doesn't work in a democracy, right? So uh, I feel like the affordability pressure has expedited kind of it sped up us talking about change, right? How do we adapt? And so just that has been kind of an exciting thing for me, being kind of a missing middle proponent. So
All right.
hopefully we do something cool.
Yeah. All right. Last one here. If you weren't in the land development industry, what would you do?
Oh man, that's a toughie. Uh, yeah, I don't know. I don't know. I love it. I love what I do.
Yeah.
It's a very fun thing to get to be a part of. Um, I've never thought about since I got into this business. I've never thought about doing anything else. So
All right. Well, that's
just started
fair.
me trying to get into the business.
Yeah. Yeah,
Yeah,
for sure. Well, hey, I really appreciate you coming on here. I know we had other stuff
yeah,
that we were going to talk about. Time just kind of got away from us. We'll have to do this
oh
again
yeah,
sometime and we can dig into some of these other topics. But
that'd be
what's
cool.
the best way for people listening in to connect with you and reach out if they have any questions or anything like that?
Probably LinkedIn.
Okay.
Try to be active on there. I've met a lot of cool folks. Probably met you that way. So that's where you can find me. I may not be able to respond very fast, but I'll see it eventually.
Awesome. Well, I'll throw that for all you listening in. The details to his LinkedIn will be in the show notes. So just look down in the description for this episode and you will see a link there, which will take you to the show notes page and you'll be able to get that link to his LinkedIn there. So with that said, if you're not already subscribed to the show, please go ahead and click that subscribe button. We love seeing more and more people subscribing each week, whether you're on Apple Podcasts or Spotify, or maybe you're watching us on YouTube right now. Either way, we'd love to have you come back week over week. We've got some really good episodes coming up and everything. So, again, thanks for tuning into this episode, and we will talk to you next week.